without further ado, let me introduce Mehdi Hasan.
Good evening, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Welcome to a very special edition of Deconstructed here in LA, California, in front of a live audience at the Writers Guild Theater. Today we're talking about an issue of huge importance, literally of life and death, which in the past didn't get that much attention, but thankfully, recently, has been going up and up the political agenda. I'm talking, of course, about criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, police brutality, institutional racism, dealing with a prison system which locks up more people than any other country on earth, that incarcerates black men at 6 times the rate as white men. And yes, impeachment and Iowa and Iran have dominated the news headlines in recent weeks, and the presidential election will undoubtedly occupy our attention for the rest of this year. But we cannot afford to ignore this huge issue, this festering sore in our midst. So that's what we're here in LA to discuss tonight with 2 very special guests. My first guest is an artist, an organizer, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir. A native of LA, she's currently leading Yes on R, a ballot initiative aimed at reforming the LA County prison system that will be voted on in next month's primary election. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome and make some noise for Patrisse Cullors. My next guest really needs no introduction, but I'm going to try. He's a world-famous, multi-award-winning artist and musician, Grammys, Oscars, Golden Globes, Emmys, Tonys, he's won them all. But he's also an activist, a philanthropist, a founder of FREEAMERICA, a campaign to transform the US criminal justice system by trying to end mass incarceration. And one last thing. He was also chosen by People magazine to be the sexiest man alive in November 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the legendary John Legend. Patrisse, John, thank you both for joining me on Deconstructed. John, let me start with you. You're best known, of course, for your music. A lot of high-profile music.
For my sexiness, you mean?
Sexiness and music. You pick, you choose. A lot of less sexy but high-profile musicians and artists like to throw their weight, their fame, their reputation, their name behind good causes, behind campaigns, charities, philanthropy. Some of them tend to go for the fashionable stuff, the sexy stuff, if you will. What made you get involved with, put your wealth and fame behind this rather, what some people might say, unfashionable, unsexy cause of criminal justice reform, going into prisons, helping ex-convicts turn around their lives? How did it all begin?
Well, part of it was through personal connection. And I think if you talk to any person of color in this country, all of us have relatives who have been through either the prison or jail system. All of us have had some level of interaction with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement. And so we see on a very personal level how it affects our families, our communities, I think a lot of us, and I personally was guilty of this, kind of looked at it more as a personal responsibility issue because, you know, I did the right things. I didn't, you know, get caught up in the criminal justice system, but I had friends in my community that did, neighbors of mine that did, family members of mine that did. And at the time you're thinking, oh, they messed up. They did something wrong and they deserved it. This is how we punish people for doing something wrong. They deserve to go to prison for whatever the allotted time is that's been legislated by our by our lawmakers. We assume that that's how things are just supposed to work. And there's kind of almost a fatalism attached to that. But when you realize that it doesn't have to be this way, then you start to think, well, how do we get here? How do we get off this path and change courses to have a more humane system? So I started reading. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and Brian Stevens' book, Just Mercy. I read other writers who talked about how we got to this place. I realized after reading that we were the most incarcerated country in the world. I didn't know that. I didn't know that as I was, just going through life, being pretty politically engaged and pretty politically aware, getting involved in, Senate elections and presidential elections and endorsing candidates. I was going through life.
To be fair, a lot of Americans don't know this.
I was going through life not knowing this, and I won an Oscar for Glory. We wrote this song for Selma, and Common and I got up on stage, and I had just been reading Michelle's book, and I got up there and said, in honor of Dr. King and the struggle that he fought for and that so many people after him and before him had fought for, I wanted to talk about one of the critical civil rights issues of our time when it came to justice and equality and freedom in America, which was the fact that we've decimated so many communities and families due to locking so many people up in this country, and we do it way more than everybody else. We have like 3% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. So I got up on stage when I accepted the award for Glory and said, we live in the most incarcerated country in the world, and we need to do something about it. And folks who are marching with our song, we're with you. And so I organized my team around thinking about this issue and saying, we need to do something about it. Let's engage, let's listen, let's learn, let's talk to experts, let's go to prisons and jails and talk to the folks who are there, talk to folks who have come back home afterwards, talk to all kinds of stakeholders and see what we can do to make a difference. And so we've started Free America and embarked on this journey of listening, learning about it. And I know it's not the most fashionable cause for celebrities. It's not the safest cause for celebrities because there are enemies that are pretty well organized, enemies of reform. But for me, it was personal and it was worth it to get involved in this issue because we want to see big change and we know how impactful it is.
You say it's personal. If you don't mind me mentioning this, in 2015, you wrote very movingly about your mother who was imprisoned, and you talked about how drug addiction tore apart her life, and you said, and I quote, "My mother didn't need punishment, she needed help."
Yeah, she was. She never went to an actual prison, but she went to jail, and locally in our hometown. And this was all due to her drug addiction problems at the time. This is when we were pretty young, and my parents had recently gotten divorced, and she had gone into a depression after her mother died. And this caused her to kind of spiral into a place where she started using drugs to self-medicate. And so many of us know stories of people like that. So many of us have family members and friends that descend into that same place. Some of it's because they were prescribed painkillers by the doctor and then they became addicted to opiates. Whatever the reason is, this is a health issue. People need help, and we don't need to put them in jail or prison.
Patrisse, how did you end up here as this globally renowned organizer, activist? What led you to this point where you're campaigning against prison violence, against police brutality, literally 24/7?
I am. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who is here tonight. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mehdi, for this critical conversation. I think Los Angeles is the way Selma was to the Voting Rights Act, Los Angeles is to criminal justice reform. What we do here in this county matters not just here, it matters nationwide, and I argue it matters globally. And so I really enter this work as a person who also grew up with family cycling in and out of the jail system and the prison system. And just for clarifying purpose for our audience, a jail and a prison are two different things. A jail is where people go for trial. People are usually sent there and held there, even if they are innocent. And then it's the place where they often are convicted and then sent to prison where they do their sentence. And so here in Los Angeles County, we actually have the largest jailer in the world. And our county has the largest jail department, largest police department, largest sheriff's department. And what I witnessed growing up as a child was over-incarceration. What I witnessed was police brutality. And I knew that our communities didn't deserve it. I felt it in my heart, I felt it in my spirit, and I wanted to do something about it. And so as I became politicized, as I became informed about the issue at the local level, I showed up and I started to try to figure out how do I organize specifically around the issues of policing and jailing.
So right now, I mean, you're best known perhaps globally in your role in Black Lives Matter. Right now, though, you're spearheading the Yes on R campaign, which is there's a big vote on it next month. Explain to our audience, both here in the hall and at home, listening around the country and around the world, what is that campaign? Why does it matter so much?
Sure, and John, thank you for being an early endorser. Like, John came on board when we were gathering signatures for a ballot measure. For the audience, if you've never worked on a ballot measure, it costs a lot of money to change the laws. It takes a lot of people power to change the laws. And it makes sense why rich people are able to stay in power. That is one of my biggest takeaways. And this vote, Yes on R, is a vote for the people. It's a vote that it really is about 10 years of organizing that's lifted us to this moment. So Measure R is gonna do two things. One, it's gonna hold the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department accountable for corruption. And number two, it's going to create a pathway for adequate mental health care in Los Angeles County. We have the largest mentally ill population inside our jail system, making the Los Angeles jail system the largest mental health provider. Do you all hear that? Our county jail is the largest mental health provider, which means that most of those people are being over-medicated, abused, they're being cycled in and out of the streets and back into prisons, back into jails, back into psych ERs. They're not receiving the treatment that they deserve.
Patrisse, it's funny, you mentioned the kind of rich people staying in power and how hard it is to change the law. There's a poll done by the ACLU not too long ago which found 91% of Americans want to see the criminal justice system fixed. 71% of Americans, including 52% of Trump supporters, bless them, say it is important to reduce the prison population in this country. 2 out of 3 Americans agree that black people are treated unfairly by the criminal justice system. So you have all this public opinion in favor of change reform, and yet it's taken so long to get to a point where we're actually having these ballot initiatives, measures, changing of law at the federal level.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, incarceration is a failed experiment. We have to remember, this is an experiment. This has not always been the case in our country or in the world. And so what we've seen over the last 30 years is a growth in the prison population, a growth in the jail population. And now what you're seeing is people saying, this isn't solving crime. This isn't keeping us more safe. In fact, people are coming home from jails and prisons and their families are completely upended. There's so much chaos. And so what people are yearning for in this country is a new way of relating to each other, a new way of being together. And the current criminal justice system tears our families apart.
John, you've been involved in some actual successful state-led efforts, local efforts to turn things around. For example, you were involved in Louisiana in getting Amendment 2 passed, which got rid of anti-black Jim Crow jury laws. You backed Amendment 4 in Florida, which restored, or tried to restore, voting rights to former felons. The Republicans are trying to stop that from happening.
Yeah.
What was your message when you were fighting those campaigns? How did you think, you know what's the best way to cut through to the average voter? When I say the average voter, I mean the white voter.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing what happened in Florida. It's such a hopeful story because it makes you feel like we can do a lot of major things together if we come together. And what happened is the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, led by this wonderful man named Desmond Meade.
Yeah.
He had been in prison for quite a long time, but he came out ready to lead. He came out, ready to go to law school, all these other things. But as he found out, and as everyone that finds out that comes out of prison, particularly with felony convictions, society throws up all these additional barriers to you reintegrating. When, if we were doing what was most sensible and most just and most cost-effective, we would all want everybody that came out of prison to never have to go back. We would all want that to be a high priority, but we do things that are backwards when it comes to that. We make it harder for them to get housing, we make it harder for them to get a job, and we make it harder for them to vote. And so one of the issues that he decided to focus on was, let's restore the right to vote for all these folks who had felony convictions in Florida. Florida was one of only 3 states in America where a lifetime ban was in place on folks who had felony convictions being able to vote. So the only way they would get to vote was they had to affirmatively petition the governor to relax this ban. So individually they'd have to do that, and it almost never happened. So you had over 1 million people in Florida who could not vote, and the threshold to pass a ballot initiative in Florida is 60%. So just think of how evenly divided Florida always is. You know, we're always waiting, on election night to see who wins those electoral votes. And, it's come down to 500 votes when Al Gore lost. So you've seen how evenly divided that state is and how frustrating Florida politics can be. But they were able to, in a bipartisan coalition, go to the people of Florida and say, these folks deserve redemption. They deserve a second chance. They deserve to get reintegrated back into society by voting. And it passed with over 60%.
Even Republicans came out.
Even Republicans voted for it, because in that same election, the Republicans won the Senate and they won the gubernatorial election. So folks were voting for it that were voting for Republicans.
But then you have this problem where they won the gubernatorial race. The governor is now has done everything he can to stop this referendum, this ballot from being implemented. When you look at Florida, there's pushback. When you look at, for example, the cash bail system in this country, which is such an outrage, anti-poor, anti-black, discriminatory. 2 out of 3 people in US county jails are there pre-trial, pre any kind of courtroom conviction. Astonishing statistic. And yet, in New York, you have a bail reform law which passes, comes into effect, is immediately attacked. That's the cause of rising crime. You're letting criminals out. In California, I believe, where they had the bail, there's a referendum, I believe, later this year, because the bail bonds industry managed to get it delayed. So do you feel sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back when it comes to criminal justice reform?
I feel like we're winning right now. I feel like even in Florida, if you look at how the law is being applied, the courts, and there are a lot of friendly courts that are advocating for voters' rights in the state of Florida, they're able to say, you've served the body of your sentence. And some of these fines and fees are extraneous to your actual sentence. And so we're able to certify that you're eligible to vote. So there are a lot of people that won't even be excluded because of this new fines and fees regulation, because they can get a court to tell them that's not part of their proper sentence. Because you can see how you could add all kinds of fees and things on top of things that aren't really in the body of someone's sentence, and they've served their time and they should be allowed to vote. So we're dealing with it. We're helping to raise money to advocate on behalf of folks who are affected by the law. And I think we took several steps forward and maybe a step or 2 back, but I think overall it's been a net positive. A lot of people will have their voting rights restored and will be able to vote in this year's election in Florida. And what happens in New York and what happens all around the country, there are folks who have an investment in the status quo. Sometimes it's the police unions. Sometimes it's the bail bondsmen. Sometimes it's some of these prosecutor associations. And they all like the status quo, where we punish more, we give police all the power with very little accountability. They want that system to be the system that rules the day. But folks are coming out, legislators who are being bold and saying we need to be smarter on crime and not tougher on crime. And they're not letting fear stop them from doing what's right.
Patrisse, do you agree with John that, A, do you agree that we're winning? And B, take California, for example. There is going to be this vote later this year on the bail issue. Are you going to win that?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think it depends on how you understand winning. I believe that we're building political power, and that to me is winning. We may have moments where the right lashes out on us, that's gonna happen. That's their job. Their job is to try to destroy the wins and gains that we've gotten, but we're prepared for that. And so part of what it's important, especially for the audience, for you to understand, the moment we win things, that in that moment, they're waiting to fight back. And that is not, to me, unsuccessful. That means that we are winning. That means that we're pissing people off, and we should be. And so I think, we've already gotten a threatening message from our local sheriff on Measure R. He tweeted about it. And I was like, good, you're noticing. And if we stayed worried about being attacked, we would not be out of slavery. We would not be out of a lot of really disturbing places we've been at in this country. And so we are absolutely building the power of the people most marginalized, and that to me is success.
Just you mentioned slavery, and I'm reminded, John, you mentioned your speech as well at the Oscars. In that speech, you said there are more black men under correctional control today than there were under slavery in 1850, which is astonishing, shocking statistic. Yeah. What was the reaction to that from your fellow artists, people who, you're saying you were digging into this and reading about it and reading the new Jim Crow. What was the reaction when you say something like that on the Oscars stage? I'll never forget
my manager's mother. She's an older white lady in Philadelphia, and she's a liberal woman, and she was just astonished that I said what I said on stage. I was like, what is John smoking? She's like, I can't believe he said these stats. That can't be true. And I think a lot of Americans just really didn't know it was true. And I took a little bit of heat for saying it, but I felt vindicated because I knew I was telling the truth. And I wanted to shock people and make them say, we need to make some change happen. And I followed it up with action. I spent the last several years following it up with action and really working on this issue and trying to solve it and speaking about these issues in front of crowds like this all around the country for years now.
Just briefly, what kind of things has Free America done?
So a lot of it, some of it's been on the political side, and that's kind of separate from our proper nonprofit role. So we have to separate those things when we're advocating for candidates or things of that nature. So I personally do that. But we have been out there creating awareness. We've been saying, these are the issues that are most important. Let's inform people about the role of district attorneys, for instance. We've gotten involved in, I personally have endorsed the district attorney candidates, but also as Free America, we've been educating the public on this is what a DA does, and this is why you should care about your DA election. Because a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that so many of the sentencing decisions, the choice of what to charge, the choice of what kind of bail to pursue, all these decisions are made by unaccountable prosecutors. So they're unaccountable because we don't hold them accountable. Yeah. And if we pay attention, we vote and we create demand for more progressive prosecutors. We get them, and I personally endorse people like Kim Foxx in Chicago, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, all of whom are making real changes to change the way the policies work in those cities.
So I want to come back and talk about this in a moment, about the progressive prosecutors, about the importance of elections and politics. We've got a big election coming up nationally in November. Before I do, Patrisse, John mentioned nice liberal white lady says those statistics can't be true. Racism, when we talk about racism, one of the words we hear before the word racism is institutional racism. Just want you to explain to our audience, when you say the criminal justice system is institutionally racist, what do we mean by that?
Well, I mean the entire country is racist. It's founded on racism. America, the concept, the way it's been produced, what it's created is an anti-Black racist country. And so when we're talking about the criminal justice system, we're talking about a system that has relied on using that anti-Black racism to punish people and to use punishment as a way to talk about mass incarceration. And so our system is a system that has completely decimated communities, and it's been specifically communities of color. In Los Angeles County, 80% of the jail population is people of color, 50% are Latino, 30% are Black. And so I think it's been really important it's been important in the last few years to challenge this idea that this isn't a racist country or that we don't have a racist president, even though in the one breath he'll say something racist in the next breath and say, I'm not racist. And so we have to keep sort of grounding down in what is racism, how it impacts institutions, and how it impacts the people that are part of those institutions.
So you mentioned the president. What do you make of President Trump trying to portray himself as a champion of criminal justice reform? Last week you had the Super Bowl ad where we saw Alice Johnson, grandmother who was serving a life sentence for selling crack, freed by Trump. And also in his State of the Union speech, he said, and I quote, "Everybody said that criminal justice reform couldn't be done, but I got it done," referring to the First Step Act that he did sign. What's your response when you hear him or Republicans say, those are the facts?
I think we have to be really careful about what we're categorizing as criminal justice reform. And so if we look at the immigrant rights movement and this call to abolish ICE and detention centers, that is a huge part of the criminal justice system. And so if we are only talking about one part of that system, if we're only lifting up one individual, if we're only talking about one single act, that isn't actually progressive. That isn't actually reform. And so my challenge to 45 and my challenge to people who are saying he is, being the criminal justice reform president is that is untrue if he is at this very same time holding babies in detention centers. That is not criminal justice reform. And I think what he's doing, he's an effective media person. What he's doing is he's framing Black people as his way to move us to vote for him. And so he's really touting us. And so Black folks in the audience and listeners, be careful. That is you being used. That is not authentic engagement.
And
John.
just to tie another bow around it and maybe move us to the prosecutor conversation, his Department of Justice has a whole slew of prosecutors, and they make discretionary decisions about how they pursue certain crimes and how to implement these laws that are put into place. They are even advocating for people who were freed by the First Step Act
to get back in prison.
Yeah. So their Bill Barr is an extremely punitive,
Attorney General.
Very far right Attorney General. So when he's implementing policy, he's not only undermining the law, he's making it worse than it was prior. The status quo is worse than the status quo.
So listening to you, John, can I assume that when you say all this stuff, you disagree with Kim Kardashian West, who has praised Donald Trump for his, quote, passion on criminal justice reform and says it was really remarkable to see how committed he is to all of this. Do you agree with that?
He has a passion for self-aggrandizement. I think he has a passion for trying to cheaply win Black votes. I think he has a passion for doing whatever helps Donald Trump. I think he has no passion for actual justice. And he has a passion for undermining the FBI if they're investigating him as well. I think all of his motivations are selfish and self-serving, and he has no concern for the ordinary lives of ordinary folks.
He also has a passion, this week you saw, he has a passion for the death penalty. So this week, the week after he said he was a criminal justice reformer, he comes out at the White House and says he wants to bring in the death penalty for drug dealers and copy China.
He supports what the Filipino president is doing there and other oppressive regimes around the world are doing. He believes we should be more punitive, more destructive.
Which is so
in our
scary because
system.
The Intercept, my colleagues Liliana Segura and Jordan Smith did an amazing series which I urge you all to check out, Counting the Condemned, where they put together basically a database of everyone who was sentenced to death since 1976. And one of the interesting statistics is in recent years it's gone down, the number of people sentenced to death. And there's this worry now, again, that one step forward, two steps back, with this president and with this party, are we going to see now a new urge for the death penalty?
Well, that's why this is a critical conversation around district attorneys. Are we ready to go there?
Yes, let's go there.
Raise your hand if you know what your district attorney does.
Less than half the crowd?
less than half, but probably better than it used to be 5 years ago, because I would swear to you 5 years ago, no one would know. I didn't know what our district attorney did.
I only know from watching Good Wife. I'll be honest. I'm British. That's my excuse.
The district attorney seat is probably the most powerful seat in your county. It's the person who can tell you if you're gonna spend no time in jail, more time in jail, the rest of your life in jail, get the death penalty. And so my big thing, when 2016 happened, I was like, you know what? I'm not really trying to mess with 45, but what I can do is be home and change the system at home. And what I've encouraged people wherever I go is look at your local system. If we have a strong county, that means we have a strong state, that means we have a strong nation. And if we're living in the resistant state, supposedly, then that we have to force our counties in this resistant state to also be resistance counties. So the district attorney that we have right now, DA Jackie Lacey, boo. I didn't even have to prompt you. That means we've done a good job for the last 2 years. Has sent the largest number of people to death than any other county in the country. She claims that she is for people with mental illness, but she has refused to create a true department that's really helping people with mental illness. She was against Prop 47, against Prop 57, all propositions that were for criminal justice reform, and she's ultimately turned her back against the community. And so we're calling for a new district attorney, and we're lucky in Los Angeles because we actually have 2 other people who are running against her.
So on that note, John, let me bring you into this conversation. You're backing, you held an event with him last week, I believe, George Gascon,
That's correct.
who is running, he's a former San Francisco DA,
Yes.
former police officer. What do you say to people who say, isn't it weird that the incumbent, Jackie Lacey, is a black woman and her challenger is a white guy, and yet on criminal justice reform, this is the person to get behind? Supposedly.
Well, I think it matters what they stand for. Identity isn't going to be the sole determinant of what their policies are going to be. And Gascon has been a leader when progressive district attorneys, progressive prosecutors, we had a convening of them in New York years ago when we first started our campaign. And we could fit them all in a little table at the Soho House in a little side room at the Soho House in New York when we met with them. And he was one of the leaders of that group. And as we've started to help get more elected over the years, we've seen those ranks grow. But he's been a leader before a lot of other people were, and he was doing this in San Francisco and helping lead what happened in California as well through the work he was doing. And he's been at the forefront of a lot of the reforms that we want to see. And so we think he's the best person for the job that's running, and so that's why we support him.
It's interesting, Patrisse, that he's a former cop himself. And yet the police unions, both in San Francisco and in LA, are vehemently opposed to his candidacy.
Good sign.
That's honestly, whatever the police unions are for, be against. Whatever they're against, be for. It almost works every time.
So, that's good advice on the DA's race. Not that I'm endorsing anyone. But I will ask this. Apart from the DA's race, obviously, very important, and you very eloquently, Patrisse, laid out how important it is at county level, resistance counties. Obviously, it's equally, and some might argue more important, less important. What happens in November at the presidential race? Is there a candidate that you fancy on criminal justice reform? I know that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both endorsed the Yes on Our campaign. Is there someone you think is going to be the president who can help turn around this super tanker on criminal justice reform? Lead from the top?
Well, I do want to talk about the DA race and the presidential race. I'm going to be very New York Times. I'm actually endorsing both George Gascon and Rachel Razzie. I think we need all hands on deck to get rid of Jackie Lacey. And depending on who gets into that office, I do think we need to be training a new system inside of Los Angeles because that office is so corrupt, and we need new people to come in and change it. And so I'm excited about the both of them. I'm ready to really, get people involved. So this is my official announcement tonight, but I'll be making one tomorrow morning as well. In relationship to the presidential candidates, I'm going back and forth between Warren and Sanders. I've had great conversations with both of them. I think that they would both be excellent presidents of the United States. I think, I want to beat Trump. I, with my whole heart and soul, want to beat Trump. And so I also want to beat Biden. I just want to be really clear with this audience.
I mean, I think that's almost done.
Which shows you where the country is at. And so, those are the two candidates that I'm really interested in and I'm having the most conversations with.
And I think it's important for us to think about this holistically because I've endorsed Senator Warren for the Democratic nomination, but I didn't do it on one issue. It wasn't just because of criminal justice. It was a holistic judgment based on what I thought, I thought would be the best president.
Have you been impressed? Have you been excited with the fact that candidates are taking this issue seriously?
Yes, and I think it's because of people like Patrisse, people like me, all of us in this room that are pushing our candidates. Even you saw this with Hillary, even in 2016. Like, Black Lives Matter, folks were pushing her, and she responded. And I think she responded well to a lot of the critiques she was getting about some of the things she had said back in the tough on crime era of the Democratic Party, of when her husband was president. And I think she was getting pushed, and it was a healthy push that we were giving her. And so I think all of us, no matter who the candidate is, have to keep pushing them and telling them that they're responsible and accountable to us. And they need to listen to us, and they need to be afraid of pissing us off. So whoever this candidate is, but we also have to be smart and realize that Gascon is going to affect, or whoever the DA is going to affect more about what's happening in Los Angeles when it comes to criminal justice than any president ever will, okay? You have to be very aware of that. So you have a multi-pronged strategy. You can't just be thinking about who your president's going to be or even who's going to represent us in Washington. We have to be thinking about who's running this city, running this county, and who's up in the State House in Sacramento.
Yep. It's a very good point. And Patrisse, I would say, when I was prepping for this, I was thinking of asking lots of questions about Joe Biden. But I think we may not have to worry about Joe Biden for very much longer. In fact, when this airs, New Hampshire will already have happened. But you know who else is running and is now zooming up the polls? It's a man named Michael Bloomberg. And interestingly, Michael Bloomberg was the Republican mayor of New York. And here's what's interesting. When he announced his campaign, he said, I'm really sorry about, what I did, the stop and frisk, and maybe we went too far, and no one told me at the time, and I was asleep, or whatever it was. What's so interesting, on the one hand, it's kind of bad that he's so cynical that he waited all these years till he ran for president to say, I got this wrong. On the other hand, it's kind of cool that he felt he had to say that before he could enter the Democratic race.
Absolutely. There is a growing movement that has been bubbling up for a decade that is challenging all of the elected officials that decided to lock up people like my brother, people like my father, the dozens of community members and family members who were children, literally. And so these candidates feel accountable. And that is because of us. That is because of our movement. And for me, and part of what happened during the 8 years of the Obama administration is people felt like, okay, we got our president, we're good. And that is the worst thing for you to do when you're part of democracy. We need to be in the democracy. This is what that looks like. It's why in 2016, when 45 got elected, everybody was like, oh, shit. People got comfortable.
I love that you don't say his name. That's kind of cool. I'm going to borrow that now. 45.
I can't do it. I can't do it.
And just before we end this, the presidential part of this discussion, I'm just going to say a name and you can both respond. Pete Buttigieg. I didn't ask the audience to respond. Who wants to go first?
I honestly don't know that much about him. He was the mayor of a small city, and I truly don't know that much about him. I'm not shat on any Democratic candidates that may be our nominee that I'm gonna have to go out and knock on doors for. I'm not gonna do it. So I want all of us as voters to push our candidates to be the best candidates they can be. And whenever we have a nominee, we need to keep pushing them, but we also need to be clear that we need to win the White House.
And if the presidential nominee wins the election and rings John Legend the morning after their election victory or the morning after the inauguration, says, if I have to do one thing, I only have space to do one thing on criminal, what should I lead with? What's the first thing I should do?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to come up with I would do a lot of thinking and say, here's an agenda, here's a criminal justice agenda that we would really get behind. But again, I really believe that so much of these decisions that are impactful are going to be the ones we're getting involved in LA, in Florida, in New York. All these states and local areas control so much of the system. 10% of our prison system is the federal prison system. So it's a tiny portion of what's happening in the country. The First Step Act, Trump was very upset that we didn't talk about him at that event I did with NBC.
I believe he called you boring John Legend.
He called me a boring
filthy-mouthed wife.
With a filthy-mouthed wife. He was so mad. He was so mad that we didn't talk about him, but we didn't talk about it because it's not that big of a deal, and it didn't impact that many people. And then his Justice Department was undermining it as it was getting implemented. So it's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the other things we need to get done.
I love that the master of the insult for you was boring John Legend. That's the best you could come up with on Twitter on a Sunday night.
My wife agrees that I'm pretty boring now.
Okay. Patrisse, one thing we haven't talked about today, but very briefly, I do want to get your take on it, which is something that the Democratic Party and even progressive prosecutors haven't touched yet, which is prison abolition, the prison abolition movement. It sounds so crazy radical when you tell someone who doesn't follow, you want to get rid of prisons. Just briefly tell us what the case is.
Sure, yes. I am a prison abolitionist. I believe in, and really what that means, prison abolition, yes, while it means the getting rid of policing and prisons as we know it, it's actually a call for our imagination. It's a call to imagine something really radically different, a call to imagine a different way of being in relationship with each other and a different way of dealing with harm and violence in our communities. And so for me, I've been an abolitionist for almost 15 years. It feels really natural to me. I'm so glad that it's finally getting some sort of like popularization, but it's a call to have a true conversation about what we've invested in. We've invested in policing and imprisoning people who are mostly homeless, who are mostly drug dependent, who are mostly mentally ill, who are suffering. And how can we actually attribute that to a healthy system?
But what would you say to people who say, I'm sure you get this all the time. All the time, which is,
the rapists and
we're
the
all
murderers.
fine with letting out non-violent offenders.
Absolutely.
What do you do with the serial killers and the rapists?
So what I say is, let's not start there. It's actually not, it's actually a right-wing conversation to start there, because we can have that conversation.
Start with the majority.
Yes, let's start with the 80% of people who are locked up in our jails and prison who actually deserve health, dignity, and humanity. And then no abolitionist is saying release the 1.8 million people out of jails and prisons today. That's not what's being said. What's being said is let's actually reinvest our dollars, our resources, and our spirits to something different.
Absolutely, and I want to, and we have just accepted the status quo for so long. It just feels like it's the natural order. Like we just assume everything that someone does wrong means they should go to a prison or jail. Why is that the only solution we have to anything? Why is that? It's just like our gun issue. Everyone's like, oh, we just need more guns because other people have guns. It's like, it's just this destructive cycle.
You had that quite interesting intervention back in September when Felicity Huffman from Desperate Housewives was sent to prison for the college admission scandal. And a lot of people were like, what about all these black women who go to prison for longer? And you said...
I said, none of them should be going to prison or jail. Like,
level down.
Yeah, level down, not level up. And my point was, it's a failure of imagination that we think prisons and jails are the only solutions we have to these issues. And most of these issues are due to poverty, mental health, drug addiction, all issues that can be addressed in other ways, and we can prevent these crimes from happening in the first place if we take smarter steps to do so. But all we're doing is investing in punishment and policing, and it does not work. It simply does not work.
Okay.
It does not keep us safer.
Before we finish, and that's a great way to round up our discussion, before we go to our audience, because I do want to bring in our audience members, I just want to ask one thing more. One of the reasons I admire both of you so much, and I'm delighted to have you on the show today, is that you both take a very global perspective when it comes to criminal justice reform issues, issues of discrimination, issues of basic human rights. John, you're one of the few celebrities, actual A-listers, if you don't mind me calling you that, who has linked the fight for human rights, civil liberties, the fight against detention, mass incarceration here at home to what's been going on in the occupied Palestinian territories. How did you come to that position where you're on Bill Maher and you say, quote, as progressives, we should also speak up for the human rights of Palestinians? It's not something we often hear from A-list musicians.
I just feel like that's a baseline. That's a baseline human position. There should not be a whole group of people in a country just because of their nationality or their religion being held in open-air prisons and denied freedom of movement and having their land annexed by settlers and all these things. That's just a human position. It's not. I'm not an expert in this area, but
you are one of the few kind of very, very, very famous people to have spoken out about it. That's
yeah,
why.
but I think it's just as someone who's observing what's going on and saying this is right or this is wrong. Clearly, that's wrong. What's happening to the Palestinians?
Yeah.
It's so obvious. Anybody who doesn't believe that's the case are being willfully blind, I believe.
And Patrisse, we saw back in 2014, 2015, you saw Black Lives Matter protesters holding placards saying, from Ferguson to Palestine. That was a pretty astonishing, amazing, unique connection to make at the time.
Yeah, I mean, what was happening in Ferguson while folks were being tear gassed, Palestinian community members were tweeting at them on how to heal themselves of the tear gas. It was a profound moment, and then many of us of the Black Lives Matter movement actually went to Palestine in 2015, January, and I remember being on that trip and having conversations with folks, and one of the women looked at me and said, you look shocked. Are you okay? Like, you never really experienced anything like this, huh? And I said to her, well, the only time I've seen anything like this is when I've been on the prison yard to visit my father. And so the issue around Palestine, I think our generation in particular, millennials, have really challenged this idea as if we stand up for Palestine, that means we're anti-Semitic. I vehemently disagree with that. And I think that what you've seen is a new generation of grassroots leaders and now people in Congress who are standing up for what's right. It's literally a human rights issue.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. I'm going to open it up to the audience now for questions. We've got a roving mic. Stick your hand up. Obviously, we can't bring in all of you. We'll try and bring as many of you can. Please keep your questions or comments as brief and to the point as possible. Don't be one of those people who gives a speech and annoys everyone in the hall. Don't be that person. That's my free advice to you all. Raise your hand and we'll see who's coming. Gentleman there. Yes.
Is there a correlation?
Do you want to wait for the microphone to get to you? It's coming. It's coming.
That way we'll get you on the broadcast.
Who is that? Is there a correlation between problems in the criminal justice system and housing discrimination, and how do we fight that problem?
Okay.
Sure, yes. I mean, it's all deeply connected. So if we're looking at Los Angeles in particular, we look at what happens when people's neighborhoods are being gentrified. Gentrified neighborhoods are the first neighborhoods to be over-policed. They're the first neighborhoods, obviously, to have rising rents. People either end up on the streets or they end up moving. Those people are being criminalized for being homeless, and then they end up in the county jail system. And so it's a deep connection, and many folks who are doing housing work are also doing work around criminal justice reform. This conversation, though, is really a conversation to our elected leaders. they need to make a choice and whether or not they're going to allow themselves to work with corporations that allow for our neighborhoods to be gentrified. We need to be challenging them. The other thing is Nimbyism. So in Los Angeles, as we've seen, lots of elected officials are finally saying, you're right, this is a public health crisis, we need to get more infrastructure so we can end homelessness. And then you have people in the community saying, we don't want shelters in our neighborhood. So this audience seems like a really woke audience, thank God for you. And I will also challenge us around how we see people who are homeless. Because we have an opportunity to try to challenge and change what's been happening over the last 30 years in Los Angeles. And it really is up to us to say, yes, we are going to allow this shelter in our community. We're going to allow housing in our neighborhoods.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think too many of us, I think, have a very kind of NIMBY liberalism overall, and where you see it the most, if you talk to someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who does a lot of great writing on school segregation, folks that are in these liberal, so-called liberal places that all voted for Hillary and Obama and et cetera, do not want black kids going to their schools. And yes, that's some of you too in this room. So I want to be very clear, like if we want a just society, part of it has to come through allowing these spaces to become desegregated and allowing folks to live in our neighborhoods, go to school with our kids, and you can't be a NIMBY liberal.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Young lady here in the second row.
Hi, I'm Iman. I'm in high school. How can young people like me help people understand how bad the prison system is and how unfair and racist it is?
One of you want to take that one?
Well, I think part of it is, I think that initial stat that I gave on the Oscar stage is actually very useful, because when you start by saying we're way worse than any other country in the world at this issue, and we're supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, Americans like to think we're awesome at everything.
You're not.
But we clearly aren't. Like, we are possibly the worst when it comes to criminal justice around the world, because we lock up so many people and
healthcare.
Exactly.
And guns.
And it's so related, though. But it's so related. All these things are so related. It's like we keep shooting ourselves in the foot because we've been so anti-black for so long, anti-people of color for so long, that we've gotten too comfortable with throwing so many lives away, and we've harmed the whole country because of it.
Okay, let's try and take someone from the back. Gentleman there in the blue shirt. Yep. Ooh,
Hi,
hat's coming on for the question.
I got to stretch
That's
out
his
my
question
back.
hat.
Yeah, for the audience, so you can see me and everything. I'm a clean-cut guy, what have you, okay? This is help get rid of the stereotypes and so forth. I grew up in South Central LA, followed the steps of Ralph Bunche from the same high school, the same university, productive member of society, but I'm still a victim of police brutality in 1990 before Rodney King. But did I have videotape evidence? It took 3 years. My attorney talked me into dropping the case that I did so I could move on and move forward. But anyway, this is just, I thought that was going to solve the problem, right?
Do you have a question? Can I ask
Oh,
at
the
end of
question is, the point is that what happened to people studying in the Netherlands? It works for them. They got to shut down the prisons. They can't even feel the people.
Okay.
I mean, feel the prisons. Thank you.
All right, I think we've done
Well,
prison.
I do want to say there are countries that have been very successful with drug decriminalization, for instance. Portugal is a great example. They don't make drugs a criminal justice issue at all. So it's not handled by the criminal justice system. It's handled by doctors and by people that know about drug dependency and how to help people who are on drugs. And if you, Chris Hayes has a good podcast from this week, Why Is This Happening? Interviewing a woman who wrote a book about the opiate crisis and how useful medication is for getting people off of opiates. And we're not doing the things that reduce harm and help people get healthy. We're just focused on crime and punishment, and it's just the wrong approach.
Okay. Let's take lady there with her hand right up. Yeah.
Hi, I am currently studying criminology at Cal State Long Beach, and I recently started reading about a call for Black criminology. And so I wanted to ask Patrisse, because you asked that we needed more police in the community, from the community. So is there a call for people?
I never said that.
No, not, what did you say? That we needed people from the community to help the community. And so is there a call to action for people from communities that need help to go to school and study law, to change the law, to change the policies that are in effect?
Sure. I also I suggest a book to you, Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. I think criminology is a really interesting field. I also think it's an overly used field, and I highly doubt they're teaching about prison abolition in the field. So that, I think, will really help balance what you're learning. Part of what we have to build as community is to actually believe that we're in community. The way that we stop, there's a call to stop calling the police on your neighbor, right? And how we do that is we stop calling the police, but we also figure out what are the solutions that we can do internally. And there's lots of communities that do this all the time. Sex workers do not call the police because they know if they call the police, they will be criminalized. So they're dealing with the interpersonal issues right here, right now. And that's something that can be built with each other.
Okay, let's take someone right at the back, to be fair. Who's furthest back? Whoever the furthest back person is, you get a question. Sorry, Rodrigo, I made you walk.
Patrisse, in a lot of the schools now, they are using restorative justice. What do you think about the role of restorative justice, or the role that it could possibly play in prison abolition?
Hi, Ms. Bayless.
She said that's her 8th grade teacher.
Your 8th grade teacher. Give it up for our 8th grade teacher.
Seventh and 8th grade, all of middle school. First dance teacher, and it's why I do art. It's because of her. So, I think this is a great question, and many people inside of our movement, as we were challenging police, were also trying to figure out what else can we do. Restorative justice has been a huge practice that is being used inside of the school system. And I think it's a practice that we should be using in the school system, and it's a practice that we should be using outside of the school system as well. I think if we teach children how to relate differently to each other, how to deal with harm interpersonally with each other, that really translates to the real world. It translates outside of schools. So restorative justice for the audience, really important. I'll also throw out another term, transformative justice. And also community accountability. These are 3 structures that are being used across the board in different communities and are really effective.
And I think one of the things that helps you think about why those things are so important is you realize that most people that have committed crimes in their life are also victims of crimes. And so most of them, a lot of people, that phrase, hurt people. It's true. Most people are dealing with some kind of trauma. Some are dealing with sexual abuse. If you look at the female population in our prisons and jails, almost all of them have been victims of sexual abuse or some kind of partner abuse or physical abuse. So folks that are being abused are often reacting to that trauma by also hurting someone else. And so we need to realize that when we talk about victims' rights, as opposed to being more restorative when it comes to dealing with folks who commit crimes, we're setting up a dual system that's not actually real, because the system is such that most people that commit crimes also have been victims of crimes. Most people that harm other people have also been victims of harm. And so we need to look at it holistically and say, how do we reduce harm for all of these groups?
Okay, great. Let's take a question from, there's a guy waving both hands. I gotta go. So keen. Just there. No, the guy in the glasses there. Put both your hands up again so Gina can give you the mic. Oh, he stood up. This better be good. You had both hands up. No pressure.
Well, Michael, I was really going to give the question to my wife, but in 2019...
Keep the microphone by your mouth.
In 2019, I was commuted by Governor Brown. I had life without the possibility of parole. So my real question is, Are you for ending life without? I'm talking
Absolutely.
specifically talking to John Legend because I know that.
Oh, yes, I am.
He's the guy. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, be clear, I am.
And so, how can we do that?
Well, these are things, this is part of the conversation we're having. This is why we're talking about prison abolition. This is why we're talking about alternatives to prison, because we need to change the mindset in our community, in our country, that says that we can just throw people's lives away like this. We shouldn't be doing it. And we've gotten so used to these sentences. There are countries around the world where 15 years is the longest they ever send anyone to prison. We can't even fathom that in America. We've gotten so used to putting people away for 25 to life or life without parole.
John,
We're so used to it. And those countries are safer, happier, healthier, and they're not locking anybody up for this long.
Since you embarked on this journey, have you had people come up to you, I'm just wondering, like victims of crime, people who have lost a family who say to you, come on, that person XYZ killed a family member or did something to my family. I don't want them out. You might say that's humane. I don't want them out. Did you ever have to deal with people like that? I'm just wondering.
I have met with survivors of crime, victims of crime, and like I said, most people who are victims of crime, a lot of them are in the prison right now because they've committed crimes too. And so we have to realize, like I said before, this whole separation you think of between victims of crime and people who have committed crimes is almost non-existent because so many people have dealt with both. And so we have to realize, if we're going to make a change, if we're going to do something big and major to solve this issue, that we can't lock people up forever.
Yeah.
It's not solving the problem. It doesn't make us safer.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Let's take lady here.
Hi there, Rita Kurtz from Harvard. Thank you, thank you. I do live in Beverly Hills.
That's a great intro. From Harvard, but I live in Beverly Hills.
But I wanted to know, we're here in the present and we're here in the now. Our present is President Trump. He's our president. So in working with conservatives, how can we be allies with Republicans and Democrats to try and solve this problem? Because we are in the now. I mean, that's what's happening
Good question.
now. Yeah.
Patrisse, you want to go first?
Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think if the question is around, like, how do we build a unified strategy to defeat Trump?
That wasn't really her question.
I think that's what many people are trying to do right now. I don't know, the word ally doesn't actually make sense to me when it comes to being allies with Republicans. I don't think that's the strategy. I'm not trying to be facetious.
Do you have grassroots Republicans in LA who are supporting yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. But I don't actually think that's a good way to start the conversation. If we're talking about a unified strategy around how we challenge social ills, that to me is more interesting and more important. And if it's a unified strategy to defeat 45, the person who's caused an immense amount of destruction to people, to families, to the planet, I think that there's a lot of folks that are interested in trying to unify around that. The people who are not interested, conservative, right-wing folks, I don't think there's room to allyship with them. I don't think that's the point. And there's this weird sort of notion in America that we have to be allies with everybody. And I don't think that's true, especially if the people who are harming you if people are asking you to be allies with people who are harming you. So there's a difference, right? As an organizer, my brain thinks in strategy terms. What's strategic? It's not strategic for me to reach over the aisle with a Republican who wants to see my family have the death penalty or locked up. Why? But it is strategic to reach my aisle over with someone who may be a Republican who's like, I don't want to see this either. That to me is...
So you have people, put aside the Republicans who may have a conscience, just deal with the kind of, there's a Newt Gingrich type of Republican who says, I support criminal justice reform partly because the cost it makes, they've looked at the numbers and this is ridiculous how much we're paying to put people in prison.
So I think you can strategically ally with folks on particular issues that you agree on, and that's how you get them passed through a Senate that's not fairly representative of this country. Like you have to usually get someone from either a Democrat from a red state like a Joe Manchin or someone like that, or if you're lucky, you might get someone, like the Iowa senator that was behind the First Step Act. Certain times you can get people to ally with you, and you shouldn't reject that support just because you don't agree with them on a bunch of other issues. if you guys can align on that thing, and it's going to improve lives, align on that thing and get it done.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Please keep them short, and we'll be able to get more in. Gentleman there. Yeah, no, red top. The guy who just did like a high five to himself when he got the microphone.
All right, so my name's Noah Lee. I go to USC. I'm going to combine me and my friends' questions because they go together. So our questions were, since we're in college, what can we do both here and at home to like help notify people about these issues?
Oh, that's great. If you're a registered voter here in Los Angeles County, vote on March 3rd. If you're interested in joining local movement work, we have multiple people here in the audience that are part of Reform LA Jails. Please stand up really quickly if you're part of Reform LA Jails. Look around. We got a crew. So
how did you spread them around the audience so evenly?
Strategic.
Perfectly placed.
Wow, you were a good organizer. You were a good organizer.
Meet and check in with these people because we're not just doing work specifically around policy. We're thinking about culture and art and everything. Wherever you are from, think about the issues you feel most interested in, most passionate about, and start working on those issues to go back home to do them. I'm a big fan of people going back home and doing local work. If you feel like you're moved by Los Angeles, stay here, but still do local work.
And I think a good framing for all of these conversations, I thought we did a good job when we all worked together to pass Prop 47, was say, schools, not prisons. And Patrisse mentioned this earlier, but framing this as a choice, because anytime people in economics talk about opportunity cost, anytime you spend your time or your money or your resources on one thing, it's not just the thing you're spending it on, but you're also eliminating the chance for you to spend it on something else. So when we frame it as a choice between, are we going to spend more money on punishment, or are we going to spend it on things that are more edifying, I think it's a really powerful way to communicate about this and help convince other people to be on your side. Because every time we spend more money to lock people in these maximum security facilities, the more times we do that, the more money we spend on police and other punitive actions, we're not spending on something else. And we need to spend it on those something else's: healthcare, education, mental health, all these things.
Okay, last two questions. Gentleman here at the front who's been waiting for a while, and the lady there waving. No, there's lots of people waving, so I don't know anymore. Whoever's hat just fell off. Stand up if your hat just fell off, right at the back. Stand up and yeah, it's you. Okay, you're next, but you first.
Being Palestinian from Gaza, I'm interested to know about what's your views on the 45 so-called peace plan.
Not that relevant to our subject, but if you want to answer it, you can.
Well, it's written like someone who doesn't actually want peace, and someone who doesn't believe that Palestinians should have human rights. I mean, the plan is clearly one-sided, and it's dead on arrival. It's nothing's going
sadly
forward.
I think that's fair to say. And last question of the night from the back.
Hey, y'all. I'm Ingrid. I'm an engineer, and one of the things I've done is to resist is when I've had an opportunity to work on building a juvenile detention facility, I quit. Yes. I'm not going to do that work. Two, as a person who is obviously physically disabled, I want to know, what can we do as a movement to be more inclusive to disabled people and not treat people with physical disabilities like they have a learning disability just because they mangled up? And three, what do we do about corporate crime? Because, we always talk about criminal injustice like people who do little ticky-tack drug stuff, but what about Exxon and Union Carbide and all of them? How are we going to deal with them?
I've got to say, I'm glad I went to you, Ingrid, for the last question. Do you want to deal with any of that? There's so much there.
Well, I will say that many of us in our movement are following folks like Mia Mingus, following folks who are really talking about disability justice and its intersection with our movements. I think it's one of the places where our movement needs to catch up. And needs to be challenged. I also think the rise of social media has really allowed for just much more agency for people who are differently abled. And so I appreciate this question every time it comes up, and I think it's so important. Two, that last question is a whole question about capitalism. And why Exxon exists in the first place, and why it's allowed to do the things that it's done. We canceled a huge contract, the McCarthy contract against a mental health jail, and that was a private corporation that was going to build a mental health jail for Los Angeles County. And so part of our work as movements is challenging corporations to get them out of our communities, and also challenging elected officials so their pockets aren't lined by those corporations, and that they feel accountable to us first.
John, I know as we've learned tonight and heard tonight, you don't like locking people up, but can we lock up corporate criminals, please? Just to make a point?
I want to caution us. I know we want things to be more just and more equal, but I keep saying level down, not level up. So we shouldn't be locking up the non-white collar criminals or the white collar criminals. All of them, we should think of better ways to deal with these issues. We're not going to become more free by locking more people up.
Okay, and last question to both of you from me. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what does the criminal justice reform movement that you both have been working so hard in, what does it look like? And is there a point where you declare victory?
We have to keep struggling. We honestly have to keep struggling, and we're getting wins. Like I said earlier, there are times when we have setbacks, but I'm encouraged overall that we're making the case to the American people. We're making the case to our leaders and holding them accountable, and we just have to keep pushing. And we have to realize that fear is always going to be part of this conversation, because whenever you talk about crime, some people revert to their fears, their worst fears. And there's certain politicians and police unions, et cetera, that will play on those fears. New York Post, for instance, will do the same thing. They play on people's fears, and we can't allow fear to dominate this conversation. We need to talk about community. We need to talk about health. We need to talk about taking care of each other and putting people in the kinds of safe and healthy communities where we won't even have major crime problems because of that.
I think in 5-10 years, if we look at our budgets locally, statewide, at the national level, and if we are investing more in housing, healthcare, people having access to healthy food, public education, and we're seeing a reduction in the prison and policing conversation, we're gonna be in really good shape. Part of what happens every single year when we get new budgets at the local level in particular is every single budget gets slashed except for policing and incarceration. We need to reverse that, radically reverse that now.
And on that note, we'll have to end that conversation. Thank you to the Writers Guild Theatre for hosting us here in LA. And thank you to John Legend and Patrisse Cullors.